Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a full Frontline update for the 15th of December 2022. Lots going on as ever in the wider sort of information space. But before I get to talk about a few things, what's happened overnight? Well, actually, the Russians have been fairly busy in, Kherson, the city itself has been under a lot of pressure. It gets just constant shelling at the moment. The main administration building in the middle of there was, received some shelling, which is really sad to see. Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, Mahanets, and Nikopol down there have seen some activity. Kupiansk has seen shelling and an S-300 missile. So lots of different places all along the front, and obviously the usual shelling. There's been another ammunition warehouse hit, another HIMARS hit in Avdivka, as far as I can understand, and all the usual sort of stuff. But yeah, shelling is quite heavy along the front, and the Russians are certainly hitting some places behind the lines. As I say, Marinets and Nikopol just get a constant barrage there. Right, what are the figures that the Ukraine have released? 590 liquidated personnel, so fairly high. Tanks, 5 tanks, 9 APCs, 12 artillery systems. That's incredibly important. And 2 MLRS. So those numbers mean that those artillery systems won't be able to hit the Ukrainian troops. So the higher this number, the better that is for the Ukrainians. I think better than any other sort of number along there. I don't know. Just my opinion. 27 drones. Now, we know that 13 Shahed were taken out yesterday. That's the official figure. Whether this means that there are actually more than 13 Shahed drones that were taken out that weren't added to that weren't included in the initial figure or the official figure, I don't know. Whether this represents just drones up and down the front line, there's been more drone activity, maybe clearer skies. I'm not 100% sure, but that's a really big uptick there. One vehicle or fuel tank and one special piece of special equipment. Could be anything. So there you go. Fairly good figures for you as far as Ukraine are concerned. This is very important. So the UK intelligence update says Belarus carried out a snap combat readiness inspection of its forces. The exercises are reportedly taking place in the northwest of the country, away from the Ukrainian border. In addition, Russia has recently deployed extra units and mobilized reservists to Belarus. Belarus played a key enabling role of Russia's assault towards Kyiv from the 24th of February. However, the exercising Belarusian troops and Russian units are currently unlikely to constitute a force capable of conducting a successful new assault into northern Ukraine. That's really important that they think that, because actually there's been a lot of news recently, a lot of worry that that the Russians have been providing Belarus with a whole bunch of equipment that it could indicate that they are readying themselves for an attack. They have been doing force readiness exercises and inspections, and there's been a lot of worry that there could be a diversionary attack, or at least a major offensive coming from the north somewhere. But the UK intelligence say that is unlikely, which I think is a really significant conclusion, and I hope that's true, because actually the attack from Belarus, although it would likely be ineffective in the grand scheme of things as far as actually taking territory and whatnot in the north, it would divert an awful lot of attention away from the front line, and I think would provide a bit of a problem for the Ukrainians. Ukrainian forces hit and destroyed a Russian base in Verbove, destroying 10 pieces of equipment along with an unknown amount of Russian soldiers. Where is Verbove, you say? Well, there's a whole load of them in Ukraine. The one that I think is most likely to be the site of the strike is here in the Kherson Oblast, fairly near the Crimean border. Anyway, there you go. That's where were we? So this is a huge bit of news as far as I'm concerned. So Russia claims that hacked documents show that over 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died on the battlefield. Their bodies left with relatives told the loved ones are missing. They say a hack of Lieutenant General Serhiy Shaptala shows a complete list of all the dead, but could well be fake. It could be fake, but also that strikes me as a pretty reasonable number, actually. And if the Russians are saying that 35,000 is the number of dead, uh, then they're going to be selling that as maybe the upper limits. That's really interesting, because actually, if the Ukrainians are saying about 100,000 Russians dead, then we're looking at almost a 3-to-1 ratio there. So if the Russians are claiming, look, we've got proof that 35,000 Ukrainians are dead, and here it is, that would have been about what I was guessing their deaths were. Fascinating. And this is what the Ukrainians then came back and said in response to this. Is a presidential advisor to Ukraine says that Russian losses are already well over 100,000. Now, before I told you, I thought mistakenly that this number didn't include Wagner and LPR DPR troops. And then I went back and said, no, those are Russian figures that didn't include that, and they don't produce their figures anymore. That's right. They produced like a couple of stats right at the beginning of the war. I said, no, that is the whole lot of the troops that have been lost. Well, the official figure is 96,000 deaths. However, Podolyak says that's only regular army members and does not include Wagner or other mercenaries. He says up to 120,000 may have died. Wow. Okay, that's a huge claim, right? So it could be that another 25,000 deaths sit on top of that of Wagner, and this doesn't include the Wagner deaths. It doesn't include the deaths around Bakhmut, which is one of the biggest meat grinder areas. So anyway, that probably requires a little bit of talking about in one of my extra videos. Hugely important discussion there, and whether indeed it is true about the leaked documents there from the Russians have produced. I can't find it again. According to NATO officials, Iran has agreed to supply up to 6,000 aircraft, mostly Shahed loitering munitions and ballistic missiles to Russia. Wow. So NATO are pretty confident that Russia are right in bed with Iran, and they're going to work incredibly closely. The planned drone factory in Russia is expected to be located in Tatarstan. Huge news. US is planning to send Ukraine advanced electronic equipment that converts unguided aerial munitions into smart bombs that can target Russian military positions with a high degree of accuracy. So I don't know whether I'm going to have to look into that. I don't know whether that is sort of turning things into Excalibur type shells, whether we're talking about bombs as far as ordnance from artillery, or whether we're talking about released from aircraft here. So I don't know. But that's obviously really good. Partisans left barracks of the Russian army without electricity in temporarily occupied Berdyansk. Berdyansk is down here on the coast, and without electricity. So reports the Centre of National Resistance. So the partisans are still active. That's always a good sign. And this is potentially a huge fire. I'd like to see the most recent footage of this now. So a fire occurred at the oil plant in Angarsk in Russia. Russian media reports. And this is a video from the local media. Now, apparently, this is in the Irkutsk region. Well, they don't know how this fire started, whether it's partisan, whether it's actually attack. I mean, here it says attack, whether it's drone, whether it's missiles, or what have you. But word on the street is that it it was so big that it registered as an earthquake. The explosion was so powerful that seismographs registered it as an earthquake. So that's going to be huge to see the ramifications of that in terms of oil and logistics and whatnot, but also just what caused it, the extent of the devastation, and whether that kind of rocks Russia again as they feel vulnerable inside their own borders. That's another word name for Avdivka, so I've told you about that. And finally, just the conditions have been difficult in the last week or so. This is around Bakhmut. The Ukrainians began to receive four-wheel drive Toyota Land Cruiser 7590s. Interesting. Sidebar: 1996. I helped drive a Toyota Land Cruiser. I thought it was a 74 Land Cruiser. It might have been 75, who knows, from Alice Springs to Perth in Australia. Absolutely wonderful experience that was. Me and another British guy, 2 Dutch girls. We went, right across the outback. Absolutely stunning. Just brilliant. There you go. Anyway, random. Right, let's go on to Frontlines. Although I forgot to finish that sentence, I just went off on one. That's near Bakhmut, but you can see it's difficult to manoeuvre. So as we come to our front line, we're looking at the northeast, which is Kupiansk to Svatove-Kreminna. Fairly quiet, quite a lot of positional fighting, I think, on this front line. But there is potentially activity right up the top here, somewhere but around the Dvorichna, Hryani-Kivka, somewhere between there and Tevelzhanka or Dvorichna. There could be fighting going on there. So that is, like I've said before, this area is back on the map, but not a lot of information coming out there. So just a bunch of repelled attacks all around here, as far as I understand it. And Kuzumivka, Novosilka, very difficult to advance in the open here because you just get shelled a lot. But again, activity around there. We heard that the Ukrainians pulled out of Novosilka, and because it was sort of razed to the ground, voluntarily did so. But there still seems to be a lot of activity around there. Russian military blogger saying that they still maintain defenses around Novosilka. Svatove, apparently there's been increased attacks on Svatove, or attempts to advance towards Svatove, as according to some of the Russian sources. They say that Ukrainians have been reinforced with forces from Kharkiv, Chernihiv and other places, I think, and that this represents greater pressure being put on this area. However, it still looks pretty positional to myself. Ploshchanka, Chervona, Pavlivka, fairly standard stuff. I think the conditions have been really wet and muddy around here, which has made things pretty difficult for advance. Light vehicles have been particularly affected. In fact, if we look at the ISW account, take a quote from that. A Russian military blogger claimed that current muddy weather conditions in the Kreminna area are preventing Russian forces from using light vehicles. A Russian military blogger also claimed that heavily fortified Russian front lines, reinforced with mobilized personnel, are preventing Ukrainian mobile groups from breaking through Russian defensive positions. I've said this for a long time. I think they've had enough time to build up their defenses, both in terms of sort of the trenches and whatnot built backwards. I know a lot of people discount them, but they are something. And if they're fairly well built, they can provide more of a headache than them not being there at all, right? So there you go. A Bars 13 Russian Combat Reserve affiliated source warned that Ukrainian forces will be able to seize the initiative if they take Kreminna. Absolutely. The Ukrainian General Staff reported on December 14th that Ukrainian forces struck a Russian force concentration near Novosilka. So we'll look at that in a second. That's 58 kilometers southeast of Kreminna. On the night of the 12th, 13th, killing more than 15 Russian personnel. So military personnel. So it is. There is fighting around here, but the details are thin on the ground. I have actually moved Dubrova back to being sort of grey zone, looked at a few different sort of maps and sources. It's just really difficult. I've also moved the Ukrainian line back behind the Sherebets River as it comes up. So as we come up here, I think you can see there's just a bit more of a grey zone in between the two sides, and I think it just seems like Ukrainians aren't quite as far advanced as they have been, and I think that so down around here. So around Pavlivka down south, I've moved the Ukrainian lines back here behind the Sherebets River a little bit, or at least close to it, as I think that represents the fact that the counterattacks of the Russians have and the weather have been providing a bit of a challenge for the Ukrainians. Anyway, around Kreminna, of course, as the Russians say, if the Ukrainians took Kreminna, then that would cause the initiative would certainly be in favour of the Ukrainians, because this would cause loads of problems for the Russians going forward in terms of logistics, in terms of what would happen with these other settlements and cities. But I just don't think that would be an easy thing to do. That's an urban area, and though you could get a little bit of encirclement, you're also really vulnerable to being flanked as you try and encircle. So, this is why the Ukrainians are trying so hard up in Pavlivka and Plyshchanka, because, this would allow them the ability to encircle Kreminna. So, that kind of move. But then as soon as they start getting in here, you've got, Rubizhne and other sort of settlements around there that make encirclement more difficult. I think if you go and look at somewhere like Bakhmut, you don't have other cities right next door that make things a little bit more complicated. Anyway, so there you go. Let's move on. I said I'd let you know where Novosilka was that was hit. Probably a HIMARS attack. That's Novosilka, which is to the east of Lysychansk. We're in Kreminna there. We're just coming down Lysychansk here. So these HIMARS attacks that keep happening behind the line, Avdivka and Elchesk are sort of favourite areas to be hit. So it's repelled attacks around Kreminna, through the forest, past Bilorivka, all of these sort of repelled attacks, and then we get down to Bakhmut, where it all seems to be happening. So Bakhmut, the key to Bakhmut, as I've said before many times, Soledar and Bakhmutski to the north, and you could say even Yakovlivka to the north. There's a few outposts in Soledar that apparently the Russians have taken control of. And down south, it's Opytny and Klishchivka. It could be that the Russians have a little bit more ground just around here in Klishchivka area. But if it's really Opytny and Ivangrad, if Opytny falls, then that gives the Russians a foothold into just a full-on southerly assault into Bakhmut. And if Klishchivka falls, then of course they can skirt around. There is lots of trenches built back here and earthen defenses and whatnot, so it won't be that easy. But ideally, for the Russians, they'll be able to flank round and encircle and come up to Ivaniska and take control over this very important logistical supply route. Now, apparently, artillery is hitting this Highway 32, or the T0504, is being hit by artillery. So that is a real problem for the Ukrainians. There you go. Source inside the city has also stated that Ukrainian supply lines to the west of Bakhmut, utilizing that highway, have recently come under artillery attack and have made resupplying the city more difficult. That's a real challenge. So Bakhmut East says no reports, doesn't look good. Russian forces reportedly broke through defense lines and reached eastern suburbs, capturing multiple blocks. Footage confirmed fighting in the area. Fighting was reported near Opytny. Ivangrad defense holds there for now. In fact, Royba says about that in Opytny, Wagner are assaulting positions of the AFU 53rd Brigade, who created a powerful fortification. So there is some kind of defense in Opytny that is holding out. But this is what Opytny looks like. And I mean, this is quite a remarkable bit of footage. If we come to Opytny, there should be there's possibly this area of water there that the drone footage is capturing at the beginning. It's that water there, so it's kind of cutting into. So Bakhmut would be sort of up here. I think this is the south, this is the north, and this is coming in from the east. But I may be wrong there. But this gives you a sense of what Opytny looks like and Ivangrad looks like. Just an absolute, and I keep saying this word, but just apocalyptic vision landscape. Of course, these buildings, some of them are as high as 7 stories, are still useful for defensive means. Snipers, spotting, all sorts of stuff can happen. So just because these buildings have been hugely damaged, it doesn't mean that they aren't still in some sense useful. There you go, some higher buildings there, but it is just pretty just destroyed. It's desperately sad. Here's a bit of soundscape from Bakhmut. Listen to the crackling of fire. And gunfire. Just the destruction that's everywhere. and that's life in Bakhmut. So things are difficult there for sure. So if we look at, is a really nice war map of Bakhmut because it's nice and colourful and you can see stuff quite easily. If we take a look in closer in this river, it appears. So if we read what Andrew Perpetuous says, just to give you a bit of context here, the situation in Bakhmut is deteriorating for Ukraine. Russia is attacking basically everywhere at the same time, and Ukraine is struggling to keep ground. They launch counterattacks and occasionally kick Russia back out of certain areas, but the Russian attacks keep coming. Opitny and Klishchivka are both incredibly important for Ukraine to hold, and at the moment they do not hold them, but the situation is tough. These areas are much more important than the areas on the eastern part of the city where Russia has some success in the residential area. Ukraine will likely have to retreat across the river, which is a pity. I find it unlikely that Russia will be able to continue this sort of press across the river. I think the battle will change tempo at that point. For now, Ukraine is trying to avoid that scenario. Deteriorating doesn't mean the city is about to collapse. It just means that the front lines are weakening. It doesn't mean the lines can't or won't be strengthened either. They anchor both the south and southwest of the city. The southwest is crucial. He sort of repeats. So if we go back to this war map where the Russians have some control in the champagne factory up here and some of the industrial. This is the industrial area that's been heavily contested over the last few months. Well, now it seems in Russian hands. You've got some forested area up here that I'll talk to you about in a minute. In fact, that forested area is apparently being contested by the Mozart international mercenary group that's been formed in response to Wagner, obviously a fraction of its size, but apparently Wagner and Mozart are fighting out over there. We have this river here, and behind there'll be huge amounts of urban defenses set up, tank traps or anti-tank sort of mechanisms and loads of defensive things that will slow down the Russians entirely and make this a really, really horribly contested urban warfare if the Russians do get as far as this river. That river is a decent natural barrier for the Ukrainians, and they will have been building in contingency plans to take that into account. There are lots of barracks around here and different hotels and whatnot in the area where the Ukrainians have been holed up for a very long time, but they are being hit by artillery. You can imagine if this road out here is being hit by artillery, then the whole of Bakhmut is being hit by artillery. Artillery is the key to Bakhmut. My opinion is, and this is the sort of thing I lay in bed at night thinking about, so there's a 10-to-1 artillery advantage around here or something like that, apparently, and the Ukrainians just been hammered by artillery over months and months and months. If you want the Ukrainians to prevail in this area, then they have to be able to deal with that artillery. Somehow that artillery needs to be taken out. Whether there be just a whole swarm of drones doing reconnaissance and then hitting that with Excalibur precision munitions, I don't know how it happens, but it has to happen. Like, the artillery in this whole area is what is keeping Ukraine really, really badly constrained and having them take huge amounts of losses. So some Ukrainian units are claiming 70% losses here and they are then sort of rotated out. And it is because of the intense continual barrages from artillery. Up the north, we've got these bridges that have been taken out, and we're still unclear as to whether this is the Russians or the Ukrainians. Some saying it's Ukrainians have taken out the bridges for tactical reasons. Others saying that it was Russians. Some even suggesting sabotage. So apparently this was the first bridge that went. It was a railway bridge over the road there. Apparently this bridge is also gone, and another bridge further down the road here there over sort of a river has been taken out as well. So that would cause problems for both sides, actually. So that's why it's difficult to work out who's done it, because if the Russians advanced, then that wouldn't be ideal for them. But it's also still useful, one would think, certainly around here, for the Ukrainians to get supplies through this northern route. This is a forested area here where actually I've got the Russian lines further forward here, but it might not be. It could be that is still either under control of the Ukrainians or certainly contested. So it's a bit rough. I've been tinkering with my map lines, just looking at what a load of other sources are saying, but it is all very difficult around here. You got the Ukrainians, Chasiv Yar, which is where a lot of their sort of reserve troops, or where they're rotated or barracked. Or, this is an important place, Chasiv Yar, and that is important for helping to defend Bakhmut. But it's really difficult, and they are encroaching in these eastern suburbs. I've got the map looking a bit like that. But it could well be that you have some mappers who have the Russians basically controlling that there. So, it could be this whole area is under Russian control. If we come a little bit down south, we have this garbage waste sorting plant there with the garbage dump, a rubbish dump, and this street, the Fedora Maximenka street. So there's fighting around there, and it might be there is some rumors that the Ukrainians may have taken back this waste sorting plant, and if they have, that's going to be really useful for counter-attacking down this street and at least contesting this whole area. But whether they have definitely done that, I don't know. This was that sort of flat ground that I showed you some weeks back, where the Ukrainians were hitting Russian troops with artillery here, and you've got the aggregates behind there, and that sort of smouldering rubbish dump there. So there's so many different types of warfare going on. You got urban warfare in the residential streets. You've got a little bit of forest. You've got industrial zones. You've got rubbish dumps and quarries and aggregates, and then you've got fields, and you've got trenches, and you've got supply roads. I mean, this Bakhmut has pretty much everything as far as warfare goes, and it's just all happening there at the moment. So hopefully that gives you some kind of a rough synopsis of the state of affairs. As we come a little further down south before we go to Avdivka, if we look at Klishchivka, there is some claim from Russians that there is some land around here, somewhere around here, that they now control, which could cause a few problems. And then this land just to the west of the canal here, under control from the Russians, that gives them a bit of a springboard further west. But yeah, there's still claims that Kurdyivka, fighting around Kurdyivka, so that might not be fully under the control of the Russians at the moment. Now, as we come down south, I haven't heard too much from around the New York area and Toretsk area. We come down to Avdivka, quite a bit of news out of Vodyane. So I was talking to you about how the Ukrainians seem to be pushing the Russians back around here. Well, the Russians now today claim that they control Vodyane, and they've done a counterattack, and they've taken control of Vodyane, and have made some sort of inroads towards Pervomaisky and repelled Ukrainian counterattacks as they try to regain lost territory there. That seems rather convenient that they would just suddenly control all of Vodyane. So I'd be rather dubious about that, as ISW says the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Russian forces captured the main part of Vodyane, obviously not the whole of it. Russian sources claim that the capture of Vodyane would allow Russian forces to launch future offensive operations towards Tonyenke, which is 8 kilometers northwest of Avdivka, and allows Russian forces to interdict Ukrainian supply routes from Orlivka to Avdivka. So this would cause, this is Tonyenke that they're talking about there, cause problems with getting supply into here, because if you have Vodyane, you'd then move up towards here, and then you'd have fire control over these roads. That's Orlivka they're talking about. So you'd have fire control over this road. So Vodyane is really, really important. Now, whether the Russians do have the main part of that, it seems like that would be taking, even if they'd suddenly taken all of this area, it just seems quite a lot to have done in a day, when you think how difficult it's been in every other place around here, and how long it takes to take these places. Anyway, there you go. As we come down south, we move on to Marinka. So Marinka is as it has been for some time, fierce fighting continues. Russians were able, according to Rubar, to take the highway towards Krasnohorivka, which I told you about yesterday, cutting off its supply line. And No Report says in Marinka, the 79th and 95th Air Assault confirmed that they have pushed back Russian forces somewhat east to the outskirts. The city is under Ukrainian control. Again, that seems to me rather amazing, considering this has been contested for so long. But I would just say that there's continued fighting there, and it's pretty apocalyptic. In fact, to show you that, here's a video of a Russian tank going into this sort of southern, I guess, part of the city. So that's here, around here. Let's just show you a little bit of that. You can just see, again, I keep using the term apocalyptic. It's just what it looks like. Just the destructiveness of war. Small arms fire. So there you go, and just more of that. Just tanks, that tank fire obliterating sort of parts of buildings. So that's in that southern area there. But it's going to be pretty much like that all over. It would be interesting to see if the Ukrainians have had a little bit of success there. As far as coming down south here, I've moved my lines somewhat. So I've moved my Russian lines further towards Novosilka, just in line with other mappers. I've kept the Ukrainian line where I thought it was. I just want to wait to see for confirmation there. In other areas around here, I've sort of adapted my lines a little bit. It's quite quiet around Pavlivka and Vuhledar. Further west now to where there was some activity yesterday and the day before, Velyka, Novosilka, Neskutchnya as well. I've actually adapted my lines there a little bit. I've moved the Ukrainian lines further south just to fall in line with some other sources, but I've left the Russian lines there, trying to work out exactly what's going on in Neskutchnya, because there's sort of lots of talk about that, and it's quite a hot area at the moment. So both a Russian military blogger and Rubar have both said that the Russians have switched to a defensive position around Neskutchnya, which is, considering they were attacking with such force towards Velyka Novosilka just a few days ago, that's telling you something. And they also say that the Russians have repelled Ukrainian attacks pretty much along a lot of this front line around there. Other than that, not a lot else to report on the Zaporizhia front line, and actually not a lot else to report on the Kherson front line. The Kherson is incredibly quiet other than shelling. So Kherson city has absolutely taken a hammering recently, and that's a real shame. But that's what's happening around here. There isn't much other than sort of artillery duels taking place. Some of the usual places that we hear a lot of, Skadovsk has been hit again, Lazurna there, and Ochakiv as well. The port infrastructure in Ochakiv keeps getting shelled by the Russians. So a number of those places are fairly turn up fairly commonly in terms of targets to be hit. Anyway, that's an overview of the front lines. Thank you so much for watching. I'll get out a Ukraine War Update extra video later, but I really appreciate you spending the time with me. You take care, and please like, subscribe, and share.